In this tutorial I will show you how to knit this sweater. It is made in only one piece and you only have to sew the sleeves and the sides. You start knitting on the back and continue knitting to the front part. And in this case I used 10 buttons. This pattern is for a 1-year-old baby, but you can find other sizes in our website. We need 4mm yarn, 3.5mm needles. I use circular needles, but you can use the needles that you want, scissors, a yarn needle, and 10 buttons. Remember that this pattern is for a 1-year-old child. And now I am making a little sample to show you how to make the stitches. We start making a slip knot and cast on 70 stitches. You can see in the description below a link to our free knitting lessons where you can find different ways to cast on. So cast on 70 stitches. Once we have the 70 stitches, we will work 74 rows with the garter stitch, making knit stitch on each row. 74 rows working knit stitch to make the garter stitch. Once we have the first row with knit stitch, we continue in the second row with the same, making the knit stitch. One knit stitch on each stitch. Remember, make the garter stitch to have 74 rows. Once we have the 74 rows, remember that here I am making a little sample. We start making the increases to make the sleeves. And we have to cast on at the beginning of the row 3 stitches. We cast on 3 stitches like this. And we work the knit stitch on the 3 stitches. We continue with the garter stitch, working the knit stitch in all the row. Once we finish this row, remember here we have the 3 stitches that we increased. We have to increase 3 stitches, making the same, casting on 3 stitches at the beginning of the row. So cast on 3 stitches, and continue with knit stitch to the end of the row. Here we are at the end of the row where we have the 3 stitches that we casted on the previous row. We need those stitches and cast on 3 more stitches. And repeat the same. We need all the stitches to the end of the row. This is the 3rd row with 3 increases on each row, and we have to repeat the same to have 20 rows with increases. It is the 3rd row with increases, with casting on 3 stitches at the beginning of each row, and we have to repeat the same to have 20 rows with increases. Once we have the 20 rows with increases, we have to cast on at the beginning of this row 15 stitches. We cast on using the same way that we used to cast on the 3 stitches. Once we have the 15 stitches, remember, here I am making a little sample so I have less stitches. We have to work the knit stitch to the end of the row. We need the 15 stitches and continue with knit stitch also to the end of the row. Once we finish the row, we also cast on in this side 15 stitches. And finish this row also working the knit stitch to the end. And we repeat the garter stitch without increases 34 rows. We repeat the garter stitch, work the knit stitch to have 34 more rows. Once we have the 34 rows with the garter stitch, we finish the back part. It has to look like that. Now we have to knit 60 stitches. We knit 60 stitches. And now we have to bind off 40 stitches. We knit 1 stitch, knit the next stitch, take the first stitch and pass it over the second stitch. This is the way that we bind off. And repeat the same to bind off 40 stitches. And continue knitting the 60 remaining stitches of the needle. Now we have one sleeve, the neck with the bind off stitches, and the other sleeve. Now we are going to knit one side, one front, the side where we don't have to make the buttonholes, and we need all the stitches to arrive where we have the bind off stitches. what we have to make now is take all the stitches that we still have in the left needle and place it in a piece of yarn. We take a yarn needle with a piece of yarn and take with the needle all the stitches that we have in the left needle. Once we have all the stitches in the piece of yarn, we have to make a knot and continue now knitting one of the sides. We have to cast on 30 stitches like this, 30 stitches. Cast on 30 stitches. Once we have the 30 stitches, remember here I have a little sample. We have to knit all the stitches to the end of the row. And repeat the garter stitch, knitting all rows to have 34 rows. We have the 34 rows. You can see that are the same number of rows that we made on the back part, and now we have to make the same that we did before with the increases, but now with decreases. To make the decreases, we start binding off 15 stitches. Bind off 15 stitches. And finish this row with knit a stitch. We come back on the next row with knit a stitch to the end. Now we don't have to make any decrease. Here is where we made the 15 decreases, and now we have to bind off 3 more stitches. And knit the following stitches to the end of the row. We come back on the next row, working the knit stitch to the end, and we don't have to make in this row any decrease. Once we are again at the side of the decreases, we repeat again a decrease of 3 stitches. We bind off 3 stitches. And we repeat the same to have 20 rows with 3 decreases every 2 rows. Remember, here we only have to decrease every 2 rows. We decrease in 1 row, and on the next row we don't decrease. Once we have the 20 rows with the decreases, we continue working the garter stitch 74 more rows to arrive here at the same place where we started to knit. Once we finish the 74 rows, we have to bind off all the stitches. And you can see here that it is symmetric. It has the same shape in one side and the other side. So bind off the stitches. Remember how to bind off the stitches. We knit 1 stitch, knit the second one, and take the first stitch and pass it over the second stitch. And repeat the same, binding off all the stitches. Once we finished one side, we have to take the stitches that we had in a piece of yarn. We have to take the stitches again on the needle. Once we have again all the stitches on the needle, we have to cut the piece of yarn. Now we take again the yarn of the ball and make a slip knot. Place the slip knot on the needle, and we have to cast on 40 stitches. Remember how to cast on the stitches. Once we have the 40 stitches, remember here I am making a little sample. We have to work the knit stitch to the end. We work the knit stitch in the 40 stitches. Once we are at the end of the 40 stitches, we continue knitting on the other stitches that we have on the needle. And we continue working the knit stitch 3 centimeters where we make the first buttonholes. Now I make a break to explain you how to make the buttonholes. Here I have 10 buttons, 2 buttonholes per row, and repeat 5 rows with buttons. The buttons on the same row are separated by 10 centimeters, and each row with buttons is separated by 7 centimeters. How to make the buttonhole? It's very easy. You have to knit all the stitches to the place where you want the buttonhole. For example, here I make 4 stitches and I have to make a yarn over, like this, yarn over, and knit the 2 following stitches together. Continue working the knit stitch to the place where we want the second buttonhole. And repeat the same. We make yarn over and knit the 2 following stitches together. And continue knitting to the end of the row. And when we come back on the next row, we knit all the stitches, and where we find the yarn over, we have to knit also the yarn over to make the hole. Continue knitting to the other yarn over. Knit also the other yarn over and finish the row. Once we have the first buttonholes, we have to repeat the same that we made on the other side of the front part. Remember, we made 34 rows, discounting this time the rows that we made to arrive at the buttonholes. Then we bind off the 15 stitches, bind off every 2 rows 3 stitches during 20 rows, and finish with the 74 rows with the garter stitch. Remember, making always the buttonholes on the place that you want, and bind off all the stitches. Now we only have to sew the sides. Take a needle and take 1 stitch on one side, 1 stitch on the other side, making like a zigzag, making like a Z. Once we sew the sides, it has to look like that. We continue with the sleeves. We sew the buttons on the place that we have the buttonholes on the other side. Once we sew the buttons, we finish the sweater. Well, that's all. I hope you like it. Remember to give a like, share and subscribe to receive our new videos.